Right now I'm in New York, and so protests are happening. There's some protests in a bit, and this kind of relates to the research I might present today. And I'm going to apologize in advance for my fellows from Ashkal Alwan who have seen this research develop slowly for over a year, and I will probably be really bored with the presentation. But I thank you for your patience. So I think I will start sharing my screen. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna start by speaking a bit diaristically about some events that have taken place in the last 5 years and leading up to now. And because this is how I've been recently presenting my work, I feel like through events that I've experienced myself or themes that I've engaged with, and then I try to present about the artworks themselves through those larger thematics and historical events. So this research kind of begins from the waste crisis in Lebanon that happened in 2015, where several landfills were closed down. And so there was kind of like a big mismanagement of waste, and we were able to see, so there was like a lot of dumping of trash happening in every other street, and it was infiltrating into residential neighborhoods, and it was basically really devolving into complete chaos. And it led to a lot of protests where the trash itself was being burned as a gesture of protest. And this happened in 2015, and I started making this work in 2019, basically, because during that time there wasn't really any resolution of the waste crisis. So it was basically the environment and the Beirut in general and the landscape around it was becoming increasingly hostile to living, and it was just becoming increasingly toxic. But this was also kind of happening simultaneously with the economic, the very gradual economic downturn that culminated at the end of last year with the economic collapse and the revolution, which took place in October 2019. But I was doing this work right before the revolution in Ashkal Alwan, and so I was thinking of this kind of environment, or I was thinking from my standpoint in Beirut, but I was generally trying to reflect on a larger condition of environmental and political toxicity. And so kind of like thinking of environmental toxicity as a condition arising out of a certain kind of governance, a certain kind of valuation of economic growth over the flourishing of biological life. And that led me to develop a few, like 2 or 3 works that kind of float in the same constellation of research. The first is, I'll try to go into full screen. Okay, no, so this first work is an online virtual environment that is, I'll try to access it here. Is the sound okay? Yeah, okay. So this is an environment, a virtual kind of space I made that is accessible online, and so this is kind of goes back to the theme we were discussing, which is kind of alternative world building and fictional, like just the construction of whole environments that are just present an alternative reality. So this was kind of like, this is a rooftop set next to the Beirut port, where obviously a lot of the trade happens. And it's also next to one of the landfills that opened up after the waste crisis. And it's made as kind of a fictional space that is created by someone that is occupying a kind of paranoid subjectivity and thinking of, I'll try to lower the sound. Yeah, kind of occupying paranoid subjectivity and is creating these objects as a kind of way to protect themselves. So as if they were like objects with a magical ability to protect their own body and their own well-being. And this is where I started to think of some designed objects and ergonomic devices that attach to the body and are meant to optimize its functioning or take care of it. Here there are some audio that the user can listen to related to the world of the project. And yeah, I mean, I won't go maybe fully into the space, but it's available online and the link is public. And so then that was kind of the first exploration I did in this body of work. And here I was thinking of these kinds of basically of 3D skins that someone that is constructing a virtual space or a character needs to work on in 2D. So basically this is like the flesh of a human person in 2D that then wraps around the individual and before they become a 3D object. So I kind of was interested in unwrapping that skin and seeing it completely unwrapped, but then also put back into the 3D space and kind of thinking of like the limits of an individual and of the individual subject in a specific city or in a specific sociality. And how do we think of when an environment is toxic, how do you think of protecting yourself or privatizing your risk and your own welfare versus kind of thinking of collectively navigating a risk or a shared risk. So yeah, this was kind of a playful way, and I would make these like diagrams. These are diagrams that engineers use so they're like systems diagrams, and they're made like when an engineer is doing a study on like a waste management system or on an incinerator or on a garbage collection system, like there would be these kind of diagrams to map it out. And I was thinking of how those diagrams end up governing our bodies and our interaction with the environment in ways that are not directly visible. And I made a film, but I think I will present it at the end so then I can play like 5 minutes of the film at the end of my presentation. But yeah, so I made a film called Kink, Retrograde, and I shot it with, and one I would like to thank I want to thank the help of everyone who was with me at Ashkal, some of whom are present here, will help me in coding this environment, and it would not have been possible without his input. And Veda was there when we were shooting this film, so she appears in the film and she appears in the shot I'm going to play. And also everyone else in the program who was there for feedback and for discussion, and your input was really valuable during this time. So these are some clips from the film. I won't really show them. I won't really show them because I'm going to play the clip. But in parallel to the film, I made these kinds of. I started work. I think this is when I started my sculptural practice, which has been so far based on ready-made objects and artifacts that I repurpose and then transform through the sculptural process into obviously into artworks, but then also into objects that kind of blur the line between a designed object that can be occupied by a human body and just kind of like a decorative object that you can't really use, that loses its function through the sculptural process. So this object is a spine brace that belonged to someone I know. And it's made to help someone during a time of recovery or during a time of healing. And basically it's to support the body and to support your spine and abdomen when you're moving, like getting up or sitting or just moving about your day. But like I had a lot of emotional attachment to that object, so I kind of like wanted to transform it into something else that isn't really accessible, or isn't like, that can't be occupied by a human, but also it's kind of a recliner. Like in the end, it starts to look like a reclining chair, but you can't really use it. So, and there's also an asymmetry in it. So if you kind of look closely, like the members are not fully symmetrical, even though it looks like a piece of furniture. And yeah, like this is, here you'll see like actually maybe I should minimize this. And so yeah, so this was kind of like the process when I was thinking of these two objects, because I'll show the other sculpture. Yeah, like this is how it would, like I will think of the original object and then I will kind of transform it into a final output. But this is another work that I did at the beginning of this year, and it is also based on a spine brace, but a different kind of spine brace. So it's basically this is a spine brace that is meant that someone wears when they're using a computer for a long period of time. And the idea is, this was also during the same time when the revolution had happened in Beirut. And what I was thinking of is all these people who are now like not, I mean, I was thinking of people who are workers in the traditional sense, like people who we think of, when we think of a worker or the proletariat, we think of someone who is, okay, this is too isolating. I'm gonna put back the grid. We think of workers who are kind of like working in a factory or working in an assembly line, like in a more Marxist sense, this is the kind of worker we think of. But this brace is meant to help someone who's doing kind of more digital labor. So someone who's more of a managerial, in a more managerial position, someone who has to do more like digital labor into a computer. And I was just thinking of all these people who are now not using their capacities to work, but were completely like striking and using it to be on the streets and to protest and to participate in revolution. So I was thinking of the labor that goes into an uprising, and this is something I'm seeing now in Brooklyn, where because there's a large unemployment rate, there's a lot more people to protest. And what I was thinking of is also like concepts of the general intellect. So the general intellect is like the functioning of society in general, and the way society like advances into new research and into new technologies and into new scientific research. And I was just thinking of how in the moment of strike, like a lot of that general intellect is disrupted, or it stops being geared towards economic growth and is just channeled to something else. So this was some of basically this is like a collaged image printed on an aluminum surface, and it's attached to the spine brace. And yeah, so those are the two, like this is the sculptural work that I've been usually like exhibiting with the film. And I think now I'll play some of the film, but I'll explain very briefly the metaphor behind it. So I was thinking of, the film is called Kink, Retrograde, like kink in the more like fetish, like desire sense, in the more sexual sense. But I was thinking of the way kink works is that, like, let's say 2 or 3 or more practitioners participate in an exchange, but there's a contract that says that I accept that there's a risk in this exchange, and I am aware that there is a kind of violence, but I consent to it, or I have enough information to consent or not grant my consent. But the way a lot of the violence that we are subjected to through the way we're governed is not a violence that we can agree to, or not a violence that we can consent to. So it was kind of a playful way to say, what if we could think of the relationship we have to the state, or to our governing powers as kink? Like, what if we could think of what if we could actually know what all the violence is and then either decide to consent to it or not? And it's shot inside the landfill, so it's shot in this very toxic environment, in this environment that will expose a body to a lot of foreign agents. Yeah, so in the film, there's like one character that throughout the length of the film is doing these gestures that seemingly are meant for self-care, but they kind of end up being like this weird interactions with the environment, or with the water, or with like a toxic substance. And I think I'll just play the film, but you kind of have to tell me if I'm gonna have to understand if it's working for you, like if you are really able to listen and watch it, and if the frame rate is not too slow. They decided that a new contract is necessary, one that is risk-aware, requiring consent based on verifiable information. Only then would it be pure kink. Soft flesh, trusting stray molecules and digits. Pleasure and pain at the forever delayed end of the world. And so one said to the other, "Hold your ground, hold your breath, rehearse a violent exchange, or smell the air. No shelter granted. Seek no more protection than thy neighbor. When all is resilient, practice kink in the dregs of the world. Rehearse a violent exchange, scat and dance in a wasted field. Destitute power, destitute power, destitute power. Make space with a pile of ash. Build our own room in the shape of a perverted contract." All right. I think I will. Yeah. I think I'll stop sharing and we can continue. Frame rate much lower. Okay. I hope that was okay in general.
That was great, Bassem. Thank you so much. Are there any questions from our participants?
Yeah, there's just something that came up in our conversation with our group, something about September 11th. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yes. So I was born on September 11th. And I say that in my bio sometimes, but it's because I feel like I've dealt with the subject of September 11, but more generally with counterterrorism, but in not this work. So like in another work with my partner Edwin Nasser, we've worked on basically like virtual reality and trauma. So we've worked on how virtual reality is used in relation to trauma, both in US soldiers. So in US soldiers returning from Iraq, which happened after 9/11 as a result kind of 9/11. And with how trauma is dealt with in virtual reality in Iran and among, not necessarily in Iran, but in some Hezbollah and Iran-aligned instances of video game, like with Iranian regime aligned. But yeah, so we noticed that the way virtual reality is used and the way video games are used in some Hezbollah production is basically not to kind of treat a trauma as a therapeutic measure, but to kind of, it's used more in the sense of religious trauma. So there's like kind of, it goes back, there are some virtual reality recreations of some traumatic historical events in Shia Islam that are like the founding myth of that religion. And so the way virtual reality is used is that there's a recreation of Karbala through virtual reality, not in a way to treat a trauma, but to use a trauma to like inspire religious belonging and religious dedication. And you can actually, like, that research is available on YouTube. But yeah, that's my relationship to the 9/11 reference, and it's also my birthday. But yeah, you said that some way that relates to your own practice too. Maybe some of the research you presented in your individual work, or maybe you could explain more.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I was there, so obviously I'll never forget it. I mean, I was walking towards the East Village. I was walking south, but I would walk really, and that day was particularly beautiful, but I overheard the first plane. And by the time I got home, the second plane hit, which I saw live on TV. And I was actually living right near the United Nations building and amongst a lot of embassies. So, you know, I mean, there was definitely a universal trauma, which probably articulated itself more specifically or localized itself different ways. But yeah, my drawing practice, and I didn't want to say it because I wanted us to have this conversation, but part of the reason I started doing those drawings was because of my trauma. And so in some ways, that's when I became an artist.
Yeah.
I'd actually like to add too, because I'm noticing now between all of us that we're, in a way, we do deal with this notion of trauma, but more importantly, kind of also meditation through art. So I think Rodrigo mentioned something about meditation earlier, and yeah, meditation as kind of this, or our practice, our artistic practice as this healing of whatever traumas we've experienced. I mean, would you say you would agree, all of you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think literally it was kind of how I could deal with it. I mean, I left New York after that, but when I picked up the drawing, I think that's in some ways why I wasn't in touch with the abuse that my body was taking, because I was in a meditative state. So I was just I don't know. It's just my way personally of dealing with that. But it's sort of when you kind of come back from that, it's sort of like you come down from an enormous high. I mean, this is something I was personally experiencing, but I would agree with you.
I mean, I agree. I know my experience. I spent a lot of time unwell as a child, as opposed to everybody else being healthy. And, I had asthma, so I couldn't run around and do the things that the other kids were doing. And for me, drawing became my escape from everything that I physically couldn't do. And even my experiences in the Second Life realm, there were a lot of people in there. Basically, anyone that I would encounter, I'd be like, what brought you to Second Life, and what keeps you coming back? And will you take me to your favorite place? And, I was introduced to a person or met a person who actually took me to a memorial that they had created for breast cancer survivors. And this person actually was in the process of going through chemotherapy, and their body just could not do anything that they normally would do. And they used Second Life and the avatar to be able to dance and fly. And, so, if you're inhabiting this body that is other than your own, and that body has the freedom, and or that material has the freedom to, transition you through the pain, physiologically, how does that affect one, right? Does your brain know the difference between what is real or not? Can you use these as healing modalities? And through my research and experience, I would say that there is a very big yes factor to that, but there is also a disconnect that happens between your body and whatever modality you're using to escape it. That could be somewhat detrimental at times.
Yeah, and for me, I would also say that the first sculptural work that I showed here, the one that's on the ground in a chair, that object that used to belong to my mother when she was doing her cancer treatment, and it was like meant to help to regain muscle mass. But she never used it and she passed away. But that was kind of like, that would say is like the main instance where I've explored my own personal trauma in my artwork. I feel like mainly my artwork hasn't been like very personal trauma. It's more like collective trauma or a collective kind of exploration. But I feel like that's one instance where I've like directly tackled something very personal. Yeah.
Looking at your video work too, which was, one, we're talking about the time of another huge trauma to our history, the pandemic, what's happened this week, the rioting that's going on. And, I can't help but look at that video differently now and I wonder if you are too, in relation to, in a way, it feels like the kink is intimacy at this stage, when I look at that piece. And I wonder if you feel any differently about the time when you actually created versus showing it to us now in this particular situation that we're in.
I mean, definitely. The thing is, I finished editing it, like the second round of edits in late September. And I was just thinking like of this metaphor of kink, like of accepting violence as inherent and then trying to work with it rather than like pretend it doesn't exist. And then like right after I finished editing it, the riots and the uprising started in Beirut. So I was already it felt like, at the end of the film, there's like these three people practicing something together. So there's an intimacy between them, but they're like preparing for something, or they're like preparing for like a march, or preparing for like some kind of refusal. But there's like, they're sharing they're like practicing this line dance or something together. So that for me, like in my head, I'm like, this is kind of a metaphor for protest, and it's a metaphor for like rioting or public assembly that knows that there is a latent violence there, and it's not going to be a fully peaceful kind of assembly. And that's been the state of the world for the past year, or at least the places I've been in. So yeah, definitely.
It makes me also think that versus, I guess, violently protesting right now because people are so afraid of intimacy. I mean, what if groups got together and did giant group hugs? Like, how would that freak people out? You know? But that, you know, the metaphor of incorporating that dance into it really was quite beautiful, and I just love the overlay and the kind of transparency that was occurring within. It feels like a piece that moves through meta time and space.
Thank you. And I feel like we've also, like, there's some threads that came out in all our work. I feel like there's this kind of like exploration of a fluid generated kind of texture, and I feel like we're all using that kind of like fluid dynamics, and we're kind of like applying our own different metaphors to them. So we're like approaching different larger themes and concepts through a kind of like yeah, just like a liquid, I wouldn't say geometry, just like a liquid particle dynamic system,
which is way more freeing than these bodies and minds that we're inhabiting now.
Yeah.
And or even the notion of time, you know, like who's, do you know what day it is like the big question. And I'm just like, it's today. Like whatever day it is, it's today, you know? So we're kind of lost in time within all of this too, which I think is more so my comfort zone, but I know for other people it's not.
Yeah, for sure.
I have a question. It was a beautiful presentation, Bassem. Thank you. You explained some answer to my question. It seems that in the world of trauma is much needed to create a space for rehabilitation. And in this rehabilitation, it's not only the body and the material with the medical body, I mean, is needed. Also the diminished sense of self, as well as the retreat from the world outside the painful body is important. How do you see the embodiment of pain in your work, and also sense of self?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very sensitive around ideas of selfhood and like the individual self, and I'm just like always trying to find ways to think of how to access like a collective struggle or a shared struggle through an individualized pain or through an individualized whether it's a risk or whether it's like a very embodied kind of condition. And I feel like those were the things I was thinking with, like in mainly the sculptural work. Like I was during that time, like I was spending a lot of time with my mother in the hospital ward, but I was also thinking of like how the landscape in general is very toxic and has the ability to cause maybe cancer to a whole population. So I was just like kind of thinking through like my own experiences and spending that time like providing care or being in like this very vulnerable setting, but also how like the whole kind of population was facing that. And I was also thinking around that time of ideas of domestic labor, and because like this is some research that I had worked on before, like with the way domestic labor works in Lebanon is that there's like a big population of migrant domestic workers who are subjected to the kafala system, which is like this very oppressive kind of sponsorship system for migrant laborers. And like I was noticing that in the cancer ward, there were a lot of families or ill patients who had their domestic workers caring for them in their hospital room, like in their room, and like when they wouldn't have family members, the helper would be there taking care of the ill patient. When that is obviously like, so there's like these two kind of agents who are suffering. Like there's the person who's ill, and there's also the worker who is having to provide a lot more care than what they are being like light years more care and labor than what they're being compensated for. So yeah, that was also something I was thinking of, but that's not something I really like explore directly in my artwork. It's more like something that I just like, yeah, like that I either like work through more like traditional activism on in Beirut or elsewhere. But yeah, like definitely like labor and shared labor and labor that is like types of care labor is definitely something I think of a lot through the work.
Thank you.